Okay, so I'll start with Kharg Island, if I may. So, recent reports suggests the Trump administration is eyeing up seizing the island. From a naval perspective, is this a no-brainer or a strategic trap?
Well, I mean, from a tactical and operational level, I mean, certainly if the Americans, which they probably do hanging around within range someplace, have the amphibious units required, it's certainly doable. It has the kind of limited scope. But the thing is that once you do that, I mean, then you're tying yourself to a static position. You're certainly clearly now moving from the idea of regime change from the air to occupation. So all of a sudden, the Iranian strategic narrative goes to one of invader, occupier. So it's a dangerous thing. I mean, you could perform, much like the Royal Marines of old, a raid in the sense that you go in, occupy it, destroy it, all the facilities, and then it will cease to be a functioning base from which the Iranians can launch operations. But you can obviously do that with munitions that they have that don't require the boots on the ground. Changing the narrative to actually having boots on Iranian soil, American boots on Iranian soil, is a step change then strategically. As far as it being a vulnerability for them, I mean, every facility for them is a vulnerability now. They have no control of the air. They can't win a stand-up conventional fight, and they know that. And this was much more about being able to show ownership, to project an asymmetric type of power, which will be the different types of autonomous drone type vehicles that would be there, or the smaller irregular craft. And it was also for being able to, keep their claim in the Gulf against other Arab states. So it was more about kind of local domestic presence and things like that as well. So, but against the, United States Navy in a stand-up fight, it becomes kind of like thinking back to World War II and small Japanese islands that were, hopped. And if you pick one, destroy it, occupy it, and then move on to the next one, well, it wouldn't take a whole lot of work to reduce the operational capability and effectiveness of Kharg Island.
It's interesting how it hasn't been targeted yet. Is it almost a red line where it's there's so much power and wealth within that island for the regime and the world? Is it just a real no-go place at the minute, or do you think Trump will make a move on it?
I mean, certainly his military commanders would be cautioning against it for the kind of reasons I'd given before. And I mean, it's not a cheap. I mean, when I say that they have the capability, this does not mean though that it would not come without a price. So a stand-up fight going in against the defenses of the island are guaranteed to mean that there's going to be casualties. And if you're trying to wage a relatively bloodless, casualty-free kind of campaign, then the last thing you want to do is be performing the most dangerous military operation that there is, which is an amphibious operation against an enemy strong point. So, you know, that's not in, as we've seen so far, part of the menu of things that they wanted to do in order to be able to keep the casualties, because every number higher rates of casualties, of course, then domestically for Trump create problems. He's trying to make this image of the ability to wield absolute American power, military power, without risk or fear. If you start to take casualties, all of a sudden, then he gives the opposition at home and around the world and everywhere else the opportunity to start to really ask questions about what's going on and what the intent is, as well as then it gives a whole different kind of moral and ethical tinge to those conversations now that American soldiers have died.
Do you think there are any parallels between World War II and what we're seeing here?
Where I would say that the lesson from the war in the Asia Pacific for the Americans this time around is is that this regime, much like the Japanese regime, when it knew it was in a losing position, went to desperate lengths to try and maintain power. So in that case, you saw the rise of the kamikaze, a guided missile system, and the guidance system being a human being. This is why, when you look at now the Iranian use of drones and the indiscriminate use of them against neighboring areas and facilities, as well as against, American military targets, it's that same kind of level of desperation, and other commentators have talked about it as kind of this scorched earth policy. The Iranian regime doesn't care what it has to do to be able to survive, either against its own population or certainly in its neighborhood. It's never going to change. This regime believes it'll never change its role and its attitude towards the United States, and particularly Israel, who America is assisting. And that's more of the motivator than, say, the Americans. And therefore, their strategic calculus is they have nothing to lose. They'll repair whatever relations they have with their neighbors later. That's okay. That's in the future. But for right now, it doesn't matter, as long as they've got the ability to be able to destabilize and disrupt, particularly the economic foundations of the region, which have those interdependencies and links to other parts of the world, then they'll do it. So in that sense, they're kind of kamikazeing the economy in the same way as what the Japanese used kinetic munitions against the United States Navy. And of course, one of the biggest targets for this is to see whether or not they can get the effect on China to finally move, to intervene and to throw its weight somewhere into this kind of, still amorphous strategic level. I mean, the Russians are relatively where they are. They're quite happy that all the munitions that possibly could have been given to Vladimir Putin to the Ukrainians are now streaking their way up into the sky in the Middle East and not going to the Ukraine. So they've got kind of a breathing period there where they're watching that. And everybody's doing, this kind of munitions math. How many of what missile system and what's going where and how. And what does that mean in terms of, if you look in the background to this, what you're seeing is a fairly rapid kind of ramping up of different defense industries and producers, particularly of certain types of munitions. So you're getting new different types of contracts to accelerate the ability to replace. Because of course, these are the same munitions not only that would have gone to Vladimir Zelensky, but if you're trying to deter China, well, where are you going to get those from too? So there's one pool of these for the United States. And right now they're being drained into two relatively intensive areas. And there is a third kind of threat that is always there in the back of their mind. So it's becoming quite difficult in terms of that kind of resource allocation and how much is enough. And it'll be on the minds of some of Trump's military planners, definitely.
With the blockade, how long can the world economy hold out? I mean, Asia is particularly vulnerable to it.
Well, yeah, depends which part of the world you're in. So if you're the Canadians, you're sitting there rubbing your hands and hoping that you can kind of get your oil and gas infrastructure reoriented to be able to start, as Carney has talked about, to supply other parts of the world as opposed to just ship it to the United States. But that's still, quite a ways away. China, not so fussed because they have a massive amount of a strategic stockpile anyway. I mean, they've prepared for the idea of the United States trying to impose a blockade on their energy supplies in the case of a conflict with them or a Straits of Taiwan type of crisis. So if you look at the oil price and you look at the up down, I think that if there are reassurances obviously that come from different parts of the Trump administration to the oil producers, that whatever it is that they're telling them, there must be something there that they're believing. But I think it's also that the Asian market, it hasn't panicked as bad. So for example, the Indians will get more oil. I mean, this is good for Putin in the sense too, driving up every barrel of oil to a higher price It doesn't necessarily mean, though, that the price he's selling to the Indians is what it is that we see out there in the market for the rest of us to have to buy. So the people that say that this is going to be even better for Putin, yeah, it will be, but I don't think he's selling to India on the same peg as what it is that we would have to buy oil. And certainly the Chinese, with their strategic reserves, they have a certain amount of time that they can afford to have this sort of strategic patience, but it's limited. I mean, you're not going to see that certainly into the summer. There would definitely be movement, if not, you know, and that would be also the pressure that'll come to build on the United States from other countries then. So all of the smaller Asian countries, those without deep reserves, who are they going to look to alleviate this problem? And the main effort will probably come back to trying to lobby and petition and to put pressure on the United States, which the Iranians want. That's what they would like to have be the case. So you can't close that strait without there being, and I mean, that'll happen to, friends and allies. I mean, if you see what's going to happen to Europe, absolutely, you're going to start to see the knock-on effects that if you want the economies of Europe to be strong enough to be able to sustain the Ukrainian war effort, hey, there's going to be these links. Well, that means that you need to let us have the oil that we've transited away from Russian oil to da 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 da. So it's an asymmetric economic warfare tool that, Trump says that they've prepared for. And I mean, as far as the United States thinking it has, if you think only in terms of being the United States, that's true because they're an energy creditor. They don't rely on the rest of the world anymore for their energy. But if you think about it in terms of, if you believe that the United States has any friends or allies anymore, and you want to have any kind of relationship with these other countries, and you don't want their economies to crash because the American economy still actually really does need the world economy to work like it used to, then there will be pressure on the Americans to find some solution. Now, is the solution in Trump math to take Kharg Island and control physically the Straits of Hormuz now? His kind of Venezuelan Greenland thinking. I need something, I have to control something, so I take something.
Just in terms of Putin, do you see him taking advantage of this global distraction? So launching a hybrid or conventional push into NATO?
It looks like that the kind of winter offensive that he had planned is now running out of steam and time, and that the Ukrainians have again shown themselves to be the master at defense, and they've even made some counter attacks that have helped to reposition them as well for the next wave of kind of phony bargaining. And so now we're going to get to the spring, and this now becomes much more weather dependent. So as the thaw comes and the winter goes, the mud comes into play, all of that kind of stuff about mobility and the kind of things that you're looking for in terms of, the rivers get higher, all that sort of stuff. It just becomes more difficult for anybody who is planning an offensive. So it gets more difficult on the part of the Russians to be able to fulfill any kind of offensive objectives that they might have had in mind. And it strengthens the defensive side of the equation, which means that, for all of that, if Putin and his generals are quite happy to, do another reset, that means that they can now gather up, wait for late spring, early summer when the ground firms up and the weather gets better. So you look at towards May time and then try again. For the Ukrainians, that could be good. They've got their own industries now. We talked about how it is that, the West will look to buy some of their drone technologies and, and some of their ballistic missile technologies. But what they need is going to still be the reliance on some of those things that now we may not be quite so ready to give over because of the crisis in the Middle East. And this is where the Chinese come in terms of their relationship with Russia. Could they help to accelerate his kind of reconstitution now for the spring and the next wave of offensives that they want to launch? So I think I would imagine that in many ways the breathing space is good for both sides.
Could you maybe talk about the decision that the US has to make with the missiles and its weapons, whether sending it to Ukraine or Iran, and how Putin could take advantage of that?
If this continues for much longer, in the sense of weeks longer, and particularly what it is that it has to be the Iranians that have the capability and capacity to put up attacks that draw the defensive weapons, the missile systems, into action. Well, then, okay, that will start to make a drain, but it has to be for weeks. It'll have to continue because, as I say, there already has been, for a couple of years, a changing over in the Ukraine. The Ukraine has tried to be able to prepare for this day. So this is going to be accelerating its preparations. But there are still critical, particularly anti-drone, anti-air systems that it's short on that it would like to continue to get from the United States and or the West. It's those marginal systems that now say other Europeans won't give up because they're worried about what they might. So the French, the British, and the Americans now definitely will have to accelerate their rearmament program in these missile systems. And or there are a number of different kinds of movements that are on the way with their kind of this fourth industrial revolution thing they've got going on. And one of the criticisms is always whether, the Americans could sustain the cost, because most of their equipment is enormously expensive. Will this generate the need that they have to find the ability to rearm, but it will also force them down the mass and cheaper production cost line, as opposed to this more Rolls Royce. One of my colleagues, Bence Nemeth, he wrote a good thing for Rusi about this called America's Suez Moment. And it is this sort of idea that, when the Americans get to a stage of realizing that they need to now rearm and prepare for a different type of peace, given what they've done in terms of the expenditure of certain munitions, this is the way in which, now they will have to look to do it more quickly because time becomes important. You can't mess around waiting a decade to build a ship, and you can't wait for years to get missiles. They need to be cranked out on a regular basis, weekly now. And that's a different technology, and that's a different mentality and a mindset. And it's also a whole different kind of then change to your organization and your doctrine and everything else. So it'd be a massive change for them to be pushed into that, particularly to be pushed into that with the understanding that this is being done in order to still maintain credible deterrence against China. Because if you reached a point where everybody knew that you didn't have the ability to stand up in a toe-to-toe conventional fight for more than, say, a couple weeks, which is where they were at now anyway, now it gets worse. Are we into days? And if you get back to a certain level, well, then your deterrence effect starts to weaken. And then that is seen as being a danger. Is that allow the Chinese, Putin, whoever else, to think more aggressively because the deterrence effect is wearing off and not as effective?